Good morning, everyone. Hope you're seeing this a start of our webinar today. So this is the third session of the Green Road to Cali. As you may know, the COP16 of the Convention on Biodiversity will be starting in end of October. And the Asian Development Bank has been organizing webinar series leading up to the COP16 to highlight on the emerging issues and also critical issues that we are facing today on biodiversity related issues. So we had two already, and this third one is really working on and highlighting on the financing need. And as we all know, there's a huge gap around $711 billion that we really require to address biodiversity issues and move forward to build and fill in the gap so that we can use biodiversity resources not just for our livelihood but also for economic growth and also to have a sustainable development moving forward. So we have a very exciting lineup of speakers today. Just to start with, we will have opening remark by Astrid Shoemaker. She's the executive secretary of the Convention on Biodiversity. She just started her position in July, and I had an opportunity to speak with her, and she's really excited to bring the biodiversity agenda to the new height and working together hand in hand with the climate change agenda. Today, also followed by that, we have a great panel. We have Terry Townsend, advisor of the Paulson Institute, Warren Evans, our own climate envoy and the special advisor on climate change, who has been leading on the nature work. And then we will have Annabelle from UNDP, who is working on BioFin, the Biodiversity Finance Initiative, which is really critical in bringing in national budget and national initiative up to the level that we require to conserve and sustainably use biodiversity resources. We also have private sector colleagues from Gobi. It's really a pleasure to have a private sector colleague highlighting on their work on how they're working on biodiversity conservation. So with that, with no further ado, this will be a really exciting conversation with all of you. And thank you so much for participating from early morning, and some places could be evening even. And we hope to have a ample opportunity for questions and answers as well at the end. So with that introduction, please, we have an opportunity to hear from Astrid, the CBD secretary. She wanted to join live, but she's on mission. So she recorded a message for us. So over to you.
Good time of the day. Biodiversity underpins critical ecosystem functions that sustain food security, human health, and the provision of clean air and water, amongst others. Biodiversity is the foundation of socio-economic development. There is copious evidence that biodiversity loss is threatening livelihoods and human well-being. There is also evidence pointing to a positive correlation between protecting and restoring biodiversity and socio-economic development, with ancillary benefits in building resilience to climate change. It is therefore crucial that public policies and regulations, including those pertaining to how businesses operate, recognize a fundamental truth. There can be no economy without biodiversity. We also need the private sector to read the memo. Embracing the green transition is a sound strategic decision. Nature-positive investments by the private sector are crucial to bridging the global biodiversity financing gap, estimated at approximately $700 billion per year. That sum may sound astronomical, but it is dwarfed by the trillions of dollars flowing towards economic activities that harm biodiversity. $700 billion is the amount needed every year to implement the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, the KMGBF, the world's master plan to halt and reverse biodiversity loss through 23 action targets that must be achieved by 2030. Governments that adopted the global framework are naturally in the driver's seat for its implementation, but a whole of government, whole of society approach is needed. So when it comes to implementing the targets related to finance, we need all hands on deck. For governments, this means mobilizing international and domestic public finance for implementation at home and to support developing countries, prioritizing least developed economies and small island developing states. We also expect governments to address harmful incentives and subsidies and to incentivize private sector investment in the conservation, restoration, and the sustainable use of biodiversity. Market actors are expected to anticipate, prepare, and build action to halt and reverse biodiversity loss. We need financial institutions and investors to align financial flows with the KMGBF and to invest in nature-positive activities, making sure that humanity does not bankroll its own demise. Target 15 of the KMGBF establishes regulatory requirements for large businesses and financial institutions to publicly disclose their risks, dependencies, and impacts related to biodiversity along their value chains and throughout their portfolios. Achieving Target 15 means increasing positive impacts, reducing biodiversity-related risks to business and financial institutions, and promoting actions to ensure sustainable production and consumption. Voluntary market initiatives such as the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, or TNFD, are developing necessary methodologies and guidance on business disclosures. These initiatives are providing clarity and consistency that will, in turn, send a signal to investors, consumers, and all market actors that it is high time to work with nature, not against it. Finance for biodiversity will be high on the agenda of the UN Biodiversity Summit, COP16 of the Convention on Biological Diversity in Cali in just a few weeks. Parties to the convention will consider resource mobilization, a potential new financial mechanism, and the multilateral mechanism on the fair and equitable sharing from the use of digital sequence information on genetic resources. This webinar will feed into the global conversation ahead of the UN Biodiversity Summit. Thank you for paving the green road to Cali with your reflections.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Astrid, for that great message. And we all look forward to joining you for a successful COP16 and the CBD convention on the COPs. So this would be a really great start, recognizing the need to really scale up the financing for biodiversity. Now, I'll move forward to the panel discussion, and it's really exciting to have today the first speaker, Terry Townsend, the advisor for the Paulson Institute. And we all know Terry has been really leading the discussion on financing for biodiversity and great set of publications and all that. So thank you so much for joining, Terry, today. And the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Yoko. Hope you can hear me.
Yeah, we hear you very well. Yeah.
Okay, great. So thank you to ADB for inviting me to participate in this important webinar in the run-up to Cali. And I know we have a very short time each, so that we have more time for discussion and Q&A later. So I'm going to give you a whistle-stop tour of the Financing Nature report, the background about how we came to the figure of the global biodiversity financing gap. And then I'm going to focus a little bit on some of the specific recommendations that might be relevant for this group and this discussion. So just a bit of background. This report, the Financing Nature report, was commissioned by the former Chinese Minister of Ecology and Environment, Li Ganjie, in the run-up to COP15, because he recognized that the financing aspects was one of the areas that was not given enough attention previously in biodiversity discussions and the Aichi targets. And I always take the opportunity just to stress the trajectory that we're on in biodiversity and the risks associated with that. So in the last 50 years, the populations of vertebrates have fallen by an average of 69%. The extinction rate is thought to be up to 1,000 times the natural rate. And if we continue on this path, we face a future where we could lose as much as 50% of all species this century. And there are tremendous risks associated with that to us. So as has already been said by Yoko, our economy depends on nature, and that there are various reports about the percentage of our economy that is highly dependent on nature, but ultimately it's 100% of our economy is dependent on nature. And there's growing evidence to show that there are also serious public health risks associated with biodiversity loss. So we know that the risk of transfer of zoonotic diseases is higher the more we stress ecosystems. And we've obviously seen several outbreaks in the last few decades at the same time as the biodiversity loss that we've experienced. So why are we losing the biodiversity so fast? Well, it's essentially because we don't appropriately value nature in our economies. So our economic models are rooted really in the 19th century, when we had assumptions that nature's benefits and services were free and unlimited. And that may have been benign assumption last century, but certainly now we're not small fry anymore. We're having a big impact on the planet. So those assumptions are outdated. And so what that means is that we have, because we don't value nature appropriately in our economies, we have a big gap in terms of the financing towards supporting and protecting nature. And the key messages from our report, which I'll just quickly go through, is that first, the only way to slow and stop biodiversity loss is to ensure that nature is appropriately valued in all economies and across all sectors. And currently, the gap between what we spend on biodiversity today and what is needed, so that is the global biodiversity financing gap, is large. But the good news is it can be closed with some actions, which I'll go on to in a minute. Closing this gap relies heavily on governments, and I think this is a really important point. Point 4 talks about the private sector can play a pivotal role, but I think it's vital to understand that the private sector invests for profit. And the only way that you can steer private sector investment in a serious way towards nature protection is by creating the right regulatory and incentive framework that values nature and encourages the private sector to invest in that way. So just to quickly go through how we arrived at this figure, we looked at globally how much is being spent on biodiversity conservation. And these figures are from 2019. And we came up with a range of 124 to 143. I think one of the first points to note is that it's not easy to track actually biodiversity finance. We found it quite difficult. So that's why we have these ranges. And you can see that the biggest chunk of that comes from domestic budgets. So that's government money being put towards nature conservation. And a key point here is the message at the top, that for every dollar we're spending on nature conservation, we're spending around 4 or more on agricultural, fishery and forestry subsidies that are incentivizing action that harms nature. So we're in this crazy situation where $1 to protect, $4 to destroy or degrade. Then we looked at how much was needed if we're going to protect the most important biodiversity and the services that it provides. And again, we came up with a range here. And this is not only for managing protected areas, but also how we mainstream biodiversity conservation in productive lands and seascapes. So you can see, again, we've got a range here of 722 to 967 billion US dollars per year. And so when we look at take these two figures together, that's how we get the global biodiversity financing gap. And as has been mentioned previously, it comes out at an average of about $711 billion per year. So this is how much we need to find. And it sounds like a big figure, but it's actually less than the world spends on soft drinks in a year. It's less than 1% of GDP. So when you look at it in that context, it's not such a big ask. Now, how do we close that gap? We looked at this in two ways. First, how do we reduce the size of the gap? And then looking at mechanisms of how to fill it. And I think the key message here is that we can do a lot to reduce the size of the gap with no new money. So harmful subsidy reform, if we're able to reform, and that's not necessarily remove, but just change the way the incentives associated with those subsidies, we can actually cut this global biodiversity financing gap in half. So that's with no new money whatsoever. And the second area in terms of reducing the size of this gap is around investment risk management. So that is integrating biodiversity into investment decisions. And you can see here we have NA because we couldn't actually come up with a figure for this. It's so large and it dwarfs all of the others if we can get this right. So if we fully integrate the value of nature into investment decision making, we can close this gap. Now, of course, recognizing that harmful subsidy reform and integrating biodiversity risk into decision making is not going to happen overnight, we looked at ways that we can increase funding for biodiversity, positive funding, and we looked at mechanisms that were already existing somewhere in the world, happening at some scale. So these are not sort of pie in the sky theoretical mechanisms. These are all mechanisms that are happening and working somewhere in the world that just need to be scaled up. And you can see a list there, very familiar to this audience, I'm sure: biodiversity offsets, and domestic budgets, natural infrastructure, and so on. So I won't focus on them too much. This graph just shows another representation of how we close that gap. And I think that, again, the key message here is that we were very clear that even if we scale up all of these new funding mechanisms to the highest, the top of the estimates, we still cannot close the global biodiversity financing gap without reforming harmful subsidies and integrating risk into investment decision making. And of course, those two areas are really for governments, looking at how the harmful subsidies and also the regulatory and incentive framework for private sector investment. So top level recommendations from the report are about national governments must take immediate policy actions to expand biodiversity conservation financing, support countries to implement financing mechanisms identified, and catalyze public and private sector investment. And I'm going to go straight onto this for purposes of time about multilateral development banks. We felt there was a strong role for donor governments and multilateral development banks to provide financial and technical support to governments of developing countries in order to help them to reform harmful subsidies. And also, bilateral donors, multilateral development banks should require reporting on biodiversity projects and be more accountable for their application of Performance Standard 6, which I'm sure this audience is aware of, around Performance Standard 6 in terms of protecting biodiversity. Green financial products, so looking at how multilateral development banks can provide early stage concessionary and financing that helps to catalyze the development of projects to support biodiversity conservation, and infrastructure also, so clean energy infrastructure. This really brings home the point about integrating biodiversity and climate issues. So we know, for example, that clean energy infrastructure, the land footprint can be 10, 15, even more times that of traditional energy. So where we put that infrastructure is really important. And we know that there was a review in, I think it was 2020, that found over 900 clean energy projects in the pipeline that were going to impact on important conservation areas. So bringing together, if we focus just on climate, with all good intention, we can be addressing climate change and supporting low carbon energy, but exacerbating biodiversity risk. So it's really, really important that we integrate these two issues as much as possible. And I think that's a really important message that the two conventions in the UN are beginning to work towards. There was the recent joint report, scientific report from IPCC and IPBES, and I think that they're looking more and more to work together to bring these conventions together so that we can address these two crises in a holistic way. So I think I'll leave it there. It's probably my time. I have this one more slide, which is just about scale. So I know in the negotiations, we have a big focus on ODA. And we often say in this field that we spend 90% of the time talking about 10% of the solution, because ODA is really a scale of billions. It's politically very important, obviously, but in terms of biodiversity financing, it's relatively small. MDB alignment with Kunming Montreal goals and nature-based solutions to climate finance can raise tens of billions. We're looking at hundreds of billions in terms of harmful subsidy reform. We can potentially be looking at trillions when we look at greening sovereign debt. But the real prize is aligning all private and public sector flows with the goals of the Kunming-Montreal Agreement. And then we're talking about tens of trillions. So I think that's a good point to end with in terms of where the energy should be focused in this area. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Terry. That was really an eye-opening, fantastic presentation, and where we need to put our efforts further, particularly on harmful subsidies and also green financing products. And also while we are trying to expand our climate investment, we really need to look at that impact to biodiversity. And I think you have really highlighted a critical role that we can play at ADB and MDBs as a whole. So thanks so much for providing this really great keynote speech. Followed by Terry, we'll move forward with our own Warren Evans, who's the climate envoy and also our special advisor on climate change and nature. While we are hearing Warren, please also others put your comments and questions in the chat box so we can pick it up during our question and answer period. Okay, so thank you. With that, Warren, the floor is yours. Thanks for joining.
Thanks, Yoko. Terry, good to see you. Been a while. I'm going to be pretty brief and hopefully keep this open. I'm actually going through the exit process from ADB, and so I've got some other things I've got to focus on, so I can't stay the whole time. Let me reflect a little bit on the role of MDBs in relation to what Terry just talked about, and then I'll try not to get into my pessimistic past and look at my optimistic forward thinking now. So just a couple of things. The MDBs have, an ADB being part of the Multilateral Development Bank community, we have a pretty strong track record of project level investments that relate to nature and conservation nature. It's only recently that we really are looking at more strategic, at scale, programmatic approaches to addressing these challenges. And part of what we're doing now that I think is absolutely critical relates to the issues of subsidies and domestic resource mobilization. So when you look at what the MDBs can do in this space, even though that was not in your box for MDBs, our policy-based lending operations are designed to address exactly these things. So it's about policy reform, regulatory reform, and institutional reform at the country level that's required to achieve whatever objectives they are. in the last 2 years, there's been a dramatic increase in policy-based lending focused on climate change. And of course, initially there was a lot of focus on mitigation, but more recently, it's moved towards how do countries deal with the risks of climate impacts. Whatever I've got that's optimistic now, and I've been around for a long time, and in my view, we've had lots of actions that are where we win battles, but we're losing the war. We're losing the war on nature. We're losing the war on climate change. My optimism is based on the fact that finally at the Glasgow COP 3 years ago, there was a recognition that these are one and the same war, that you can't win the war on climate if you don't win the war on nature, and vice versa. And finally, this is coming together in a very positive way, I believe. And as I travel around and meet with government officials, they're recognizing this, and certainly ADB and hopefully our sister MDBs are recognizing this. So what that means for biodiversity is that the reality is that climate change has more funding available. It has a higher profile when it comes to the political dialogue internationally. It has a higher profile because of that at the national level in most cases, not all, but most. And so climate change is still a very good avenue for accessing finance and addressing the policy and regulatory reforms that you're talking about. That is critical, because if you agree that you can't win either war without bringing these together and fighting a single war, all of a sudden you start looking at investment programs differently. You look at investment programs that have objectives that are from jobs to local economy to building climate resilience to climate impacts, to sequestering carbon in the green space, and having biodiversity benefits. All of those things. And when we look at the kinds of investment programs that we have going on right now, if we redesign those and started from that point of view, how do you actually get at scale the multiple benefits of investing in nature that we actually do get? So it comes back to your valuation issue. But what I'm talking about is valuing restoration of ecosystems. If we looked at that from the get-go when we develop programs and projects, investment programs and projects, you'd have a different outcome. You'd have a different level of understanding of governments, that they're not just investing in fisheries for fisheries purposes, they're investing in ecosystems for multiple benefits. And that, I believe, is how we're going to achieve scaled up progress on biodiversity conservation and on nature in general, having healthy ecosystems and healthy ecosystem productivity and benefits, but also sequestering carbon and building climate resilience and building jobs and economy and so on. And we're making that transition right now. And I think that's something that it's new, relatively new. I've been in this area for a long time, and I'll never forget in probably about 2007, 2008, when I was the environment director at the World Bank, my biodiversity team coming and complaining to me that climate change is taking all our money, and they're taking all the limelight. And at that time I said, look, get on board, bring them together. It took a while for that to happen, but it is happening now, and I think that's very positive. I want to just very quickly mention when you're talking about ODA, traditional ODA is never going to be what it was. Those days are gone, I think. And so we do have to focus on new ways of mobilizing finance. We launched at the last Climate COP, the Nature Solutions Finance Hub, which is a partnership among a whole bunch of different players, with the funding coming from ADB, AFD, and the OPEC Fund for Development. But it has partners from across the technicals scene, from all of the big conservation NGOs and those focused on mobilizing finance for nature. But the objective of that really is, how do you mobilize private capital? How do you use sovereign money to really stimulate private investments in nature? And I think that we've got a lot of good potential models. We're not there yet. We have good de-risking mechanisms for other things. We need to apply that de-risking model to bringing private capital in and private sector investment in. We need to think about what the role of the private sector is from the outset, instead of it being sort of gravy when we make these sovereign investment programs. Oh wow, there's potential for the private sector here. That thinking has to come up front. What we're seeing from the early when the natures do this, there's tremendous interest in the private sector to become part of this. There's tremendous interest in institutional investors to become part of this, but we haven't cracked that nut yet on how to actually make that happen. So I think we're getting there. There's a lot of work to be done, and I'm going to look forward to watching how that works. The last thing I'll mention that is a very positive development is that in the MDB world, in my world, we dropped the ball many years ago on doing upstream analytical work to drive strategic planning and investment programs. And that's when things went to project, and it's hard to add up. And Terry, I sympathize on the issue of trying to figure out what money is actually going into nature. Yoko's trying to figure that out in ADB right now, and I think we're getting there. But the good news is that, again, because of climate change, we recognize that we have to do much better upstream analytical work to determine what the priorities are. And, you know, given that we've got limited resources, even through partnerships, we have to hit the priority actions. And the only way to do that is to do what we call upstream analytical work, to understand what the risks and opportunities are and think about this long term. Now we're doing that, you know, upstream analytical work is not just climate change, it's climate change in nature. And so all of a sudden we are able to think longer term, larger scale, what are the partnerships required, and what's the money required to make this happen, and how do we take sovereign money and use it to mobilize the private capital that's required. So I'm actually optimistic in terms of the shift in how we're doing our work and the focus. I can't say I'm optimistic we're going to win these wars. All I can say is we just got to keep entering into the battles and win more battles at bigger scale with longer term impacts, and I think we'll get there. Thanks very much, Yoko.
Well, thank you so much, Warren, for joining us and really highlighting on the need for working between climate and biodiversity hand in hand and together. And that's really just happening at ADB as well as in many other places. Astrid also emphasized that as well from the CBD perspective as well. And also the fact that we really need to work closely with and get the real partnership with the private sector. And as you said, I see a lot of interest from them, and we just need to develop a good pipeline and good investment sort of mechanism and tools here. And finally, I know you're having a very busy time retiring from ADB, but we just really wanted to honor and thank you for your great efforts on climate and nature and bringing ADB to this level in terms of working on environmental issues is concerned. So thank you so much for joining us. And Terry, thanks for that clap. And so now we're moving to next exciting speaker. We have Annabelle, she goes with Abby Trinidad. She is the Senior Technical Advisor for the BioFin. I think many of us know BioFin it's a biodiversity finance initiative led by UNDP with many other partners. And actually it highlights on one of the points that Terry actually highlighted, really trying to see how we can mobilize more domestic finance and actually work with governments to work on biodiversity issues further. So I thought this would be a great introduction to what UNDP and BioFin is doing. And also actually it has been grown with GF and many other resources to grow this part. And this was sort of in the middle of Terry's pyramid, which is a very important initiative. So over to you, Abby, and great to have you here.
Thank you very much, Yoko, for the introduction. And it's really nice to be with you today in this webinar. So as Yoko already mentioned, Biodiversity Finance Initiative, or BioFin, is a UNDP global project that's being implemented in 40 countries as of now. While a lot of us who are in this biodiversity finance space are very familiar with the global estimate of the biodiversity finance gap from what Yoko mentioned earlier, and Terry also presented it. What we're trying to do now is to think, what is the biodiversity finance gap in our own countries? And to do that, we need to understand better where we are currently funding biodiversity and what are our finance needs. Next slide, please. Okay, so as I said earlier, BioFin is present in 41 countries. Around 35 are already implementing their biodiversity finance plans, while a few are still in the methodology phase. However, this year, 90 more countries are going to start their BioFin journey, or rather, developing their own biodiversity finance plans, and this is enabled by the Global Environment Facility. Usually, the ministries of finance or planning or environment are the co-implementers of BioFin in countries. A team is present in each country with supplementary expertise provided by consultants. Next slide, please. So BioFin's approach to narrow the finance gap is not solely focused on resource mobilization, but it also addresses the drivers that contribute to biodiversity loss by developing finance solutions that realign expenditures, for example, the case of harmful subsidies, and also avoid future loss. And I am really very pleased that Terry and Yoko and even Astrid has mentioned that it's not really just trying to mobilize resources, because if that's our mindset, then it's like putting money into a funnel or a bucket with a hole, because the financing just continues to dissipate while you're not addressing the drivers. And one of the important drivers is harmful subsidies, even public investments that actually harm biodiversity. Now, finance solution is a term that's coined by BioFin to recognize a finance issue that needs to be addressed. So it is a cluster of interventions that builds around one or more finance mechanisms with several enabling actions such as policy reform, capacity building, and awareness raising. Next slide, please. So all countries go through a methodology that is embodied in the BioFin workbook. This is a standard methodology that is applied to each country according to their own needs. It features a policy and institutional review, a biodiversity expenditure review, a finance needs assessment, and lastly, the culminating report of all of this technical phase is the biodiversity finance plan. We have had already 3 revisions or updates of the methodology, and this year we are going to launch, hopefully at the COP, the 2024 version of the workbook. Next slide, please. So some countries are already able to identify some solutions whilst in the technical report phase. So while doing the policy and institutional review or the expenditure review or the finance needs assessment, some countries already are able to identify some potential for generating revenues or realigning expenditures and those types of finance solutions. For example, we might notice that there are existing funds already, but it is not capitalized well, it's not implemented well, and that can be a candidate for a finance solution. Or sometimes we recognize that some park fees have been already in place for decades and have not been reviewed. So that's also a potential finance solution. Others are also helped by, okay, but here, what I'm showing you here is the catalog of finance solutions, which now consists of about 150 more or less types of mechanisms. In the upper panel are some public sector finance solutions, while in the lower panel are some private sector finance solutions or finance mechanisms. And usually a country would go through the entire catalog and pick out a few of them which might be of interest or which they might feel there is some opportunity for applying this particular finance solutions in the country. And little by little, using filters and screening tools, we are able to narrow it down to about 10 or 15 types of finance solutions. Next slide, please. Okay, so now let me just show you a few examples of the kinds of finance solutions that are being implemented now in countries. And I want to focus first on some of the solutions that have given the most results. And then I will also show you a few solutions that are very innovative and are just being tested now to see how sustainable the finance flows are, and also to see the volume of finance that can be created. Let me start first with a country that's nearby. It's Malaysia. So one of the finance solution being implemented by Malaysia is the ecological fiscal transfer, and I'm sure many of you who are in this financing space are quite familiar with what Malaysia is doing. Over the last couple of years, from 2021, I believe, they have already raised 86 million for states. This is not new money. This is money that is already in the public in the fiscal system. But what is particular about this is that the federal government provides incentives to state governments in order to expand the area of protected areas, expand protected areas. And this is the amount that has been transferred from national, federal to state. What Biofin is now trying to help with is to help institutionalize this process and to make sure that the criteria for determining how much, who, and what kinds of monies can be can the EFT incentive be used for is biodiversity positive. Another example is Zambia. This is a private sector finance solution where we have raised 200 million in terms of 200 million bond. So this is also, as I said earlier, it is a cluster of different mechanisms. So aside from the bond, we had to also work on the national framework, which will provide a tax break to those who might want to participate in this particular offering. In Ecuador, we have public green credits. Again, another public sector type of finance solution. In Botswana, as I was mentioning earlier, very simple. Protected area fees, which they realized was in the doldrums for so long. So what they did was to revise the fees, and now it is generating at least 3.6 million per year. Of course, here in the Philippines, we have worked very closely with the Department of Environment and also with some of our congressional champions to be able to lock in increased funding for protected areas, and that has resulted to a yearly increase in protected area budgets. And in the Seychelles, also a tourism fee, similar to the case of Botswana, where they realized that it's been there for a few years. Maybe we should also revise the tourism fee, and it's generating 10 millions per year. Some countries are also doing similar initiatives, not at this scale, but at least we can see that it's going to be sustainable for the next decades, the next few decades or so. Next slide, please. Now we go into some of the innovative solutions, and that's why we call it a 5G solution. Here in the Philippines, we're testing a gaming app, and you can see on your screen Animal Town. This is a gaming app which we are promoting, and the gamers through purchase of gaming, what do you call this, in-app purchases of gems or top ups will be able to contribute to conservation of particular species. This is a game for which the proceeds are going to selected civil society organizations, and it is going to be vetted by our government partner, the DENR. Another innovative solution that we are looking at is the sales of non-fungible tokens, and we have tried that. And this is sorry, but this is also an innovative solution that we're trying here in the Philippines. These are artwork, photography that we are promoting, and then the mechanism is through non-fungible tokens, and we are partnering with some private sector entities. Another innovative solution is the Zakat for Nature. Zakat is Islamic alms giving, and there is an institution in Indonesia which deploys the proceeds from alms. Its focus is really on poverty alleviation and support for religious activities, but we are trying to work with the institution now to include biodiversity as one of the pillars of deploying zakat. So that's the one of the work that we're doing in Indonesia. And lastly, I just want to speak about the nature facility. So the nature facility aims to catalyze large-scale investments into the protection and restoration of at-risk ecosystems with a focus on World Heritage sites. Now we are trying we are supporting the development of a tiger landscape investment fund to catalyze private sector investments into nature positive businesses that contribute to the protection, restoration, and sustainable management of tiger landscapes. And very recently, a colleague of mine has been in mission in Thailand, and apparently there seems to be a lot of interest to set up the investment fund and to help develop a pipeline of projects that might feed into the fund. All right, next slide. I think this is my last. Oh, okay. So just to cap this presentation, I just want to mention a few knowledge offerings of Biofin. Aside from the workbook that I mentioned a while ago, we have a guidance document on how to address harmful subsidies. Another guidance document is upcoming. This is on results-based budgeting for biodiversity. We are also developing more work on nature and insurance. And for now, we are looking at human-wildlife conflict in some of our countries, as well as doing some ecosystem-based insurance. We are also, hopefully, we want to launch this GLOBE. GLOBE is the Global Biodiversity Expenditure Taxonomy, as opposed to existing taxonomies, which serve as like a traffic light for private sector investments. GLOBE is a public sector taxonomy. So it tries to look at the NBSAP, and it looks at activities or interventions that are supported by public budgets, and we provide some attribution rates, because as we know, biodiversity is not a sector in itself. So we would like to have a better estimate of biodiversity expenditures, especially from non-core biodiversity agencies. And of late, we are also now trying to work on nature and climate finance. And it's really nice that Warren provided the backdrop for this. We are now realizing that, yes, there is more money in climate finance. Yes, it can be a good entry point. And now we are really trying to develop more finance solutions that try to integrate both nature and climate. So I think I will stop there, and thanks very much for your attention.
Well, thank you so much, Abby, for highlighting on the work that you're doing with government, particularly to work on the harmful subsidies, as well as trying to generate financing from their own sort of national budget and domestic sort of capital, and which is really exciting. And congrats for expanding to another 90 countries and can be able to cover many countries to further work on how we can work with the countries and governmental level as well. Some of the documents that you mentioned, I think would be really helpful for Asian Development Bank and many other partners. So if you can provide that link in the chat box, that would be really appreciated. Okay, so moving forward, we now have the private sector partner, and we're really excited to have Singun Batuyak from Mongolia, the Chief Compliance Officer at Gobi. And you've been working a lot on how we can integrate more sustainability in your company. And I have to say, I used to live in Mongolia, and I still have your Gobi cashmere coat after 25 years. So it shows how the quality is really good. So just to hand it over, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Yoko. Can you see the presentation?
The presentation is showing on the screen.
Okay,
so,
thank you, Yoko. Yeah. Okay, hello everybody. I'm Chingun, the Chief Compliance Officer in the Gobi Kashmir, the largest cashmere company in Mongolia. I'm going to share our experience in obtaining the first sustainable linked loan of the country together with the ADB. I will refer to the sustainability linked loan as a SLL in my presentation going forward. Last December, we secured a $13 million SLL from ADB, and this is our journey. I will start with a brief introduction of Gobi, our company, and then I will discuss about understanding on SLL and its alignment with our goals. And I will end up presentation with our progress. To give you some background about what we do, we are the largest vertically integrated cashmere company established in 1981. We are also publicly listed on Mongolian Stock Exchange. What we mean by vertically integrated is we start from purchasing raw cashmere from herders to a final product, such as you can see here on the slide, suits, coats, sneakers, and caps. Our annual manufacturing capacity is 2 million pieces. We employ around 1,700 people, of which 70% are women. Aside from operation in Mongolia, we have branches in Germany and franchise stores in 7 countries, including USA, Japan, South Korea, as you can see on the map. SLL was first introduced to us by ADB team. Although we had our sustainability development goals already set, SLL was a new concept to us. In our understanding, and put it simply, as you can see on the slide, advise, incentivize, and encourages companies to achieve sustainability development goals through SLL with interest rate savings. These goals can include reducing carbon emissions, improving energy efficiency, or enhancing social responsibility efforts. If we meet the target, we will receive interest rate savings. This will be evaluated and assured by external agency. As one of the leading company not only in the sector, but also in the capital market, as a publicly listed company, we want to set an example and create a pathway to others, establish their goals towards a more sustainable future. With that in mind, in 2022, our board approved sustainability policy and set specific goals to be achieved by 2025. For instance, we aim to reduce CO2 emissions per product by 10% and energy usage by 20%. These goals aligned with the SLL agenda. SLL was provided by ADB was highly favorable for Gobi as it aligns with our sustainability goals and initiatives. Under this loan, together with ADB, we set 4 performance targets, KPI. First, the increased raw cashmere from herders without any middleman. Second, the reduced energy consumption per product, thereby reducing CO2 emission. Conduct pasture management training to herders. And lastly, reduce water consumption per product. So to reach this target, what were we doing now? I would like to note here that before ADB's financing, we are implementing the trilateral project with the Mongolian University of Life Sciences in specific areas to promote sustainable cashmere practices since 2020. To achieve SLL targets, we built upon this trilateral project. Firstly, we significantly increased our direct procurement from herders, eliminating middlemen and ensuring higher income for herders. During our visits to the provinces that were selected under the trilateral project, we directly procured cashmere from herders, also provided training on gender equality and awareness. For the second target of reducing energy usage per product, we first conducted an energy audit and are currently calculating CO2 emissions. This helps us to establish baseline and identify potential areas for the further improvement. This loan also had a technical assistance that builds on the trilateral projects with a purpose to promote climate resilient pasture management practices in gender inclusive manner. The TA will run until 2029 and help us to reach KPI number 3 under the SLL. To address the final KPI of reducing water consumption per product, we are currently building new wastewater treatment plant with optimal technical solutions. To end my presentation, I would like to note that we believe the exercise we are doing under the SLL, we have a demonstrated effect for other entities in the market. For instance, calculating our CO2 emissions or defining the baseline requirements, engagement from various stakeholders. And because the concept is new not only to us, but also to the country, it requires lots of efforts, times, and resources. But once we establish an example and create a track record, we believe it will be easier to those who want to pursue not only SLL, but sustainable future going forward. Thank you for your attention.
Great. Thank you so much, Shingun, for this great presentation and showcasing what private sector can do to reduce the footprint on both energy, water, and also to grasslands, and having both impact on biodiversity and climate change. And this has been highlighted as a key sort of private sector investment loan that ADB has provided in this region. And thanks for showcasing that. And I hope you know, we can further expand, and there's a lot of innovation going on in the private sector side of ADB as well as others in expanding these best practices and replicate and scale up. So it's really promising to see what we can do further. Great. So with this, I think we have had a great set of sort of perspective from sort of what we can do from the government, what we can do from the private sector, and the role of MDBs moving forward. And we'll open up for question and answer. And I really just want to thank for the speakers to be on time. So we have some time to really get some feedback and inputs and have some dialogue with the participants. And I think we have a great participants today, over 60 people here. So please use the chat box, or please raise your hand so that I can notice who might want to take the floor and ask any questions to any of the speakers. Maybe just kickstart and warming up. There were quite a number of questions related to nature infrastructure. And I think, Terry, you have already started to provide quite comprehensive answers, but maybe take some opportunity considering ADB is investing heavily on infrastructure, and we are actually moving to more hybrid initiative from gray and green infrastructure type of initiative with Sponge City that you mentioned and others as well. But let me give you the floor to maybe elaborate a little bit further on your thoughts on what we can do more on the nature infrastructure side.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I mentioned in my reply in the chat box is that this is something that I think potentially MDBs could explore. In the US, under the Water Act, they recently had an amendment where I think it's the US Army Corps is the biggest implementer of water-related infrastructure, and they are now required for every project to look at natural infrastructure options. So it doesn't mean that they have to use natural infrastructure options for every project, but they at least have to explore the potential of natural infrastructure before they make decisions on how to proceed. And I think what this is doing is helping to change the mindset about natural infrastructure, because I think there is a lot of inertia about always defaulting to grey infrastructure in many cases, because that's what we've done, that's what we've always done. And so trying to change that mindset and become a little bit more open towards the potential of natural infrastructure solutions. And by natural infrastructure, I mean, we're talking about things like restoration of mangroves to help stop storm surges, instead of, or in combination maybe with smaller seawalls, that kind of thing, creation of temporary wetlands to deal with flood, extreme weather events rather than dams, this kind of thing. So, and I think that simple change has had a big impact in terms of changing mindsets about natural infrastructure. And it also helps to create capacity on the ground among the project developers on ecology and natural infrastructure, because if they're required to explore these options, they have to then build that capacity to be able to meet that demand. So I think that is something that potentially MDBs could explore, whether there's potential to integrate that kind of requirement for project developers going forward. So I think that I'd love to hear your views on whether that's feasible.
Oh, sorry, it was muted. Thanks so much Terry for that perspective. Indeed, we are increasing, particularly on the water sectors and the natural resource sectors, working on wetlands and water management, also mangrove management, sustainable fisheries, all those initiatives to really include more nature-based solutions, nature infrastructure within it. We've been supporting quite a bit of assessment and designing of those through our technical assistant. Actually, what Warren actually highlighted, the Nature Solutions Finance Hub, is really to expand those areas of work further. Warren, you mentioned about FIDIC, and actually the FIDIC playbook on infrastructure was the first session of this Green Road to Cali series. So it's really relevant. But I know, Warren, you need to go, I understand. So if you want to add any points on this and what you expect, and any other points that you heard today from the other speakers, please chime in and have some feedback. Thank you.
Thanks, Yoko. I do have to go in just a second. So I would, on this issue of green versus gray, I think two things are going to happen. First off, not only did the FIDIC come up with the new playbook, and ADB does follow FIDIC. We are partners in FIDIC, and so our procurement guidelines will be influenced by this. But also a couple of years ago, led by the American Society of Civil Engineers, the International Society of Civil Engineers has also adopted a new set of standards that are conceptually will drive the engineering practice to look at the green option as the priority. Now, at the end of the day, though, the question is whether in our case, the borrower, whether it's government or private sector, is enlightened and ready to move in that direction. And I think that in that regard, I think that one of the most important things we can do is have in our hip pocket when we go to talk to clients, have examples of why, why this is a better option and how it works, and why you should look at mangroves before you just go build seawalls. So we need a better toolkit of just real simple examples of, look, here's how they did it, in country X, and that will work here. And this is true across the board in all of the areas where we need to convince those who have to pay us back the money that they borrow from us, why this is a better option. And so we need, we need to build capacity internally in ADB, so that this is the preferred alternative from our point of view, but we also need to do a better job of convincing our clients that this is just simply a good idea. It makes sense in every aspect, and we're not there yet, but I think we're getting there. And again, I think that the whole partnership issue is critical. And on that, I want to just make one final observation, and then I'll go. And I really appreciate the Abby, your presentation. I think it's a great, we run the risk today, and I'm going to go way, way back. In the early 1990s, we had more money than we could spend, grant money than we could spend on environment. Every donor, every bilateral donor, every MDB, UNDP, we were all tripping over each other in every country. And I think that we run the risk right now of, because of the positive momentum, and I'm not suggesting we try and hold back the momentum, but I do think it's really important that going into Cali, that there is a serious dialogue on how do we make sure that we are all holding hands. Doesn't mean we have to do things together, but we have to be in coordination and in sync, and make sure that we're not, having a dialogue with the same government on the same issues, where ADB is sitting there with the Ministry of Finance, and UNDP or anybody else is sitting there with Ministry of Environment or somebody else, and having what should be a single dialogue on a single issue with cross-sectoral ministries at the country level. So I think it's incumbent on all of us to not repeat what happened in the early 90s. And most of you weren't active in those years, but it was a mess. It was a good mess. It was great to have more money than we could spend, but we could have been much more impactful if we would have been better coordinated. And I see that as a potential risk here. So I would encourage, as the old man getting out of this, kind of getting off this boat, I would encourage all of you that are on the boat to make sure that you do figure out ways to collectively maximize the impact of what we do. That's easier said than done, but I know that Yoko, you feel the same way, and that you'll drive us in that direction. With that, I gotta go, and I appreciate it. Good to see you all. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Warren. And I hope you're not getting off the boat yet, and continue to work with us on different capacities. But I think that was a really great segue, Abby, to get to you. There's also a question about how do we work with government and convince about the harmful subsidies and sort of turn it around. So I think on the coordination elements as well as this, over to you, Abby.
Oh, let me just say that it's very difficult. Last night when we had our tech call, one of my colleagues mentioned that I think about 60 NBSAPs have 60 NBSAP targets have already been submitted, and unfortunately, I think there were only 2 which targeted harmful subsidies. So it's very difficult, even in biofin countries. I must say that some countries are still not up to even doing the scoping study. But having said that, I just want to share some stories, and also to respond to Karen's question. Very interesting story from Thailand. In the course of doing our subsidy work, we found out that there is this place in Phetchaburi province where groins, seawalls, jetties have been set up because they thought that it could stem the erosion, not knowing that the erosion was caused by a once-in-a-lifetime hurricane. typhoon that caused the erosion in the area. So it's science-based. So some researchers looked at the impacts of this gray infrastructure, and they finally decided that they need to remove everything. So that's the big, I think that's the big message. The government, with cabinet approval, has decided to remove all of the gray infrastructure. How much did it cost? About $8 million. How much did it cost to remove it? About $300,000. So I think it's not really a subsidy in the strictest sense, because it's government allocation, but I think it achieved a similar purpose. So maybe apart from subsidies, we can also look at real government allocations that harm biodiversity. As to Karen's question, yes, we have done a lot of focus on agricultural subsidies in some countries. In the Philippines, I think what we can work on would be not addressing it at the national level. It's going to be very difficult, but to look at site level applications of how harmful subsidies might be addressed. Maybe it's targeting beneficiaries. Maybe it's just proper siting of corn plantations. Removing it from areas which have very high slopes, and et cetera, which leads to flooding. I think little by little we can win the war on the subsidies by focusing on small wins. Let's do site by site basis and really focus on what matters in that area, and then maybe replicating and doing a scale up at some point. So I think I'll stop there in the meantime. Thanks for the questions.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Abby, for that. And you mentioned about also you developed a guideline on the harmful subsidies issue. So we really look forward to looking into that and see what we can do too from the ADB side. But I see Terry, your hand's up. Over to you.
Yeah, just on the point of harmful subsidies, because I think it's such an important issue, and governments have committed to dealing with it for many years, and in fact it's just got worse. So clearly what efforts up to now have failed, and I think one of the things that harmful subsidies are very political in many countries, so that it's to appease political lobbies, agricultural lobby or whatever, and so it becomes very, very difficult to address. But I think one possible way of helping to unlock this issue could be to engage through legislators and through parliaments. So there are organizations, the Interparliamentary Union and others, that bring together legislators on a cross-party basis. So it helps to depoliticize these issues in terms of being linked to one specific party or another. And I wonder if being able to build some kind of cross-party consensus politically in some countries might help to build a foundation for serious reform of harmful subsidies. And I think one of the things that the priority actions must be to identify what subsidies you have that are harmful, because I think in a lot of countries sometimes the ministries don't even know. So doing an audit of all subsidies to understand which are the most harmful, and then to prioritize those for being addressed, I think is something that could happen going forward.
No, good point. And ADB is also supporting governments on the public expenditure as well as budgeting, and in that regard, looking into those impacts of the different policies are very, very important elements of it. So I think there is a space for furthering our efforts in looking into not only the efficiency and effectiveness of the sort of market needs and also industrial needs, but also looking into the environment and social aspect. And in that regard, safeguard update that we're doing also plays a key role in it. So I just wanted to see what we can do further and have some dialogue also internally as well. with that, the next set of questions relate more to public sector, and I think that is really exciting. And I think we recognize how Gobi has expanded your sustainability efforts. And one of the question was about, is there any ways that we can incorporate more small and medium enterprise? And I know that our PSOD, the public sector colleagues, as well as there is also a venture capital and others who are trying. But I don't think we have a staff to answer here right now. But I wanted to get from Gobi themselves, Chungun, your experience. You work with, I guess, small and medium enterprise as well, and what you're seeing from your side. And also another question about how you see the next step for Gobi and doing further on this sort of sustainability journey. Over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, of course, the rangeland management is a critical issue in Mongolia that I mentioned before in my presentation. There is a technical assistance agreement signed by the ADB with Gobi, and now we are in the selection process of the consulting company. After that, with that TA, we will do a research, and what can we do? Then we will define what we can do with the rangeland management issue. So that's together with the ADB, this will be our main focus in the future coming years. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. I'm trying to look for other questions, but any colleagues who want to chime in? I maybe want to invite Duncan Lang here. He is actually supported organizing this webinar, and he's the focal and the leading person on biodiversity issues in general here in my team. And maybe Duncan, any reflection, any comments from your end? Over to you.
Thanks, Yoko. Really enjoyed the conversation. Maybe just as a point on the SMEs, this is certainly an area that ADB is looking to work with, companies like the wonderful Gobi, and we have. I don't think our colleagues are on the call here, but we do have a couple of colleagues who are directly focusing on this type of business. And, we're starting to see an increasing number of transactions that are coming through on our private sector with our private sector colleagues. And I think we certainly would like to see that grow. We recently had a fund put in place, and please, anybody on the call who's interested to hear more, which is supported by the Canadian government, which is supposed to focus on climate and nature. And that really is to help businesses like Gobi grow. So if anybody's interested in that, that may help make business deals more financially viable, and also that can bring in TA resources to help on those SMEs too. So I think, we are hoping to see a rise in this, but we are already seeing it, and we're looking forward to work with people more in the future. In general, Yoko, just to respond as a general point on the presentations, I think we've seen a lot of Terry's report has been one that is quoted all the time. I'd be interested. Terry says we could do more, but like 2019 was when that study was done. I'm just wondering, what's everybody's sort of consideration? Do you think the gap is narrower now, or is it still the same, or is it worse? Because I think that sets us up for what we all need to do in this room about where we need to go. Do we need to, we all know we need to scale up, but are we working at an even worse situation, or we actually have our efforts since 2019 made a dent? Any thoughts possibly on that? You're smiling, so I think you're probably going to say something negative. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Great,
One
Duncan. Yeah, Terry, over to you.
I'll just give you a quick answer. I mean, I think the short answer is we're not sure. But I strongly suspect that we're in a worse position than we were in 2019. You know, we still have all the harmful subsidies happening. We don't yet have the sort of regulatory and incentive regime in key economies to steer investment into the right direction. So I would be surprised if the situation has improved the overall gap. But I think, you know, it's a very good question, and it's important in the context of the negotiations and you know, the COP process, to understand whether the interventions that are being made are working, and if so, you know, then that suggests that we need to scale up. If they're not working, then, you know, we need to look at what other things need to be in place to make a dent in that gap. So I think it is an important, there would be value in providing a sort of update on this financing gap every few years as we go through this process. I'm not making the offer here and now to do that, but it's something that I will talk to colleagues about and see, explore the possibility going forward.
Right. No, I think it will be important to update and have a juncture to see what the status is now, and see what we can do more part is, I think, is going to be really important. And that would be a key focus of the discussion at COP16 of CBD as well. So thanks again. Maybe the last set of questions is about the pasture land and grassland management of the Great Gobi's story. Jingun, do you want to sort of highlight a little bit more on the pasture land issue?
Thank you. There's one challenge, because, as you know, the Mongolians are the nomads. So our herders didn't like to be taught by anyone. So that's the challenge here. So we have to work very closely with them to make them improve the pasture management thing, because they think we did this before my father, before my grandfathers, so we did it this way. That's the challenge here, I think. Yeah.
Right. No, thank you very much, Jingun, for that sort of honest and also reality. And there's a lot of good traditional knowledge on the pasture management in Mongolia, and there's a lot to learn from that. And also the science are coming in to see the grassland carrying capacity and all that. So maybe the mix of that traditional knowledge and science coming up and furthering that sort of sustainability, and people wants to increase the harvest as well. So we'll hope to see the good balance coming out of this journey. Thank you. I think we're coming to an end, and I can't say how exciting this conversation was leading up to COP, because we had really a rich perspective coming from every angle. And I really think, Terry, thanks again for sort of setting the scene and bringing in that whole research and analysis, and also very concrete steps that we should be taking over next month. And Abby and Jingun and our own Warren, it was really, you know, different perspective, different roles, but all coming together, and we need to collaborate further and partner. And I think the Nature-Based Solutions Finance Hub that we have now is sort of a platform where technical and financial partners come together and boost the needed finance to scale up the initiatives that we've been doing, because there's a lot of pockets of great experiences going on, but this really needs a new scale. And I hope the conversation at CBD COP will go to that kind of direction. And also, I'm part of the advisory committee on resource mobilization at CBD, but there is a whole lot recognition that we need to really look into different sectors and come together, as well as how can we bring in private sector and additional resources to this field. And also finally, on the climate change link, I really think as a Climate Bank of Asia and Pacific, ADB have a key role to play to bring in that climate and nature agenda together. So we'll be committing on that moving forward as well. With that, I really want to thank all the partners who were part of this three-part dialogue on Green Road to Cali. Particular thanks to my own team who made this happen, Karma, Duncan, and many others who have supported this journey. And I just really want to thank you. This is just the start of the sort of Green Road, and over to Cali and beyond. Hope we continue this dialogue and get your support as well as cooperation. So thank you again, everyone, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you so
Goodbye.
much.